We have been at war with Iran for several weeks now. Thousands of Marines and members of the 82nd Airborne Division have arrived in recent weeks. A lot of discussion now about whether a ground war is the next phase. We'll get into that in a bit. I just wonder, in general, how are economists such as yourself processing all of this as it unfolds? What are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, economists always think about things using the same framework, which is basically what are the benefits and what are the costs. We're sort of coldly dispassionate about things like this. And so we have to ask, you want to ask, why do we go to war? Well, we could go to war, and if the government's functioning properly, we would only go to war if the benefits exceed the costs. Well, the benefits are hard. We don't really know the answers to the benefits partly because we don't really understand. The Trump administration has inside information we don't have. We're not sure they're processing that information correctly. We just don't really know what the benefits are. So let's focus more on the costs. That's something where we as economists have more to say about what are the costs of war. And war is costly along three dimensions. The first is human, obviously the first and most important. We've already had approximately 13 Americans die, about 300 injuries. Those are consequential. Of course, the human toll on the Iranian people is much, much larger. There's been at least 1,000 civilian deaths and more than 3,000 deaths total. One interesting question people need to ask is, do we care about those Iranian deaths, and how do we weight them relative to the U.S. deaths? All the news you read is about U.S. deaths, but presumably we as humans should value at least somewhat, in particular civilians dying in other countries.
Right.
And that should be part of the calculus we have of the cost of war. The second is budgetary. And this will be a lot of my focus today, which is the cost isn't just bodies, it's dollars. And war is very expensive. We're spending about $1 billion a day. And the Trump administration just requested $200 billion. Let's just fix ideas. I mean, we've lost track of billions and trillions these days.
It is. I mean, do you have any suggestion for how we should be thinking about things like billions and trillions and millions? Because I think there's this little bit of a trick in the language in that they all sound so similar: million, billion, trillion. Right?
That's a good point.
They sound like essentially the same thing. We know one's bigger than the other, but the order of magnitude by which they are larger is, I think, bigger than we really can grasp when we hear it fly past us. So can you just remind us the difference between a million, a billion, and a trillion, please?
Yeah. So basically the right way to think about it is to think about what it buys. Cash itself is meaningless. It's what it buys. So if you think about $1 million, then we're talking about getting, for example, health insurance for 2,000 people. Okay. If you think about $1 billion, then we're talking, which is what we're spending per day. Now we're talking about getting health insurance for 200,000 people. Okay. So basically, and then if you think about $1 trillion, then we're talking about getting health insurance for 2 million people.
Okay.
So it's really, that's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is, let's think about what 200 billion means. Okay. That's 17 years of the entire budget of the TSA. So 200 billion means we could fund the entire TSA for 17 years for that money. That is, or let's put it in terms of a recent policy debate. Okay. That is 6 years of extending the Biden subsidies for the Obamacare that the government got shut down over. The government shut down over a proposal to extend them for 3 years. We extend them for 6 years for $200 billion.
Yeah.
So this is real money. Edgar, this is, given the state of what the government spends money on these days, if you hear anybody talking about things costing millions at the federal level, you should largely sort of ignore it. That's kind of rounding error at the federal level. Billions, your ears should start to perk up, and hundreds of billions, your ears should be on fire. Okay, so that's kind of one way to think about it.
When you say it's real money, I hear you, but also another thing I think it can be sometimes difficult to get your head around is how we sort of feel these costs. So in this case, there's a lot of conversation around the $4 average cost of gas, and we can see this is like it's sort of a direct impact of the war sort of thing. But, and I don't want to underplay that, but we have been at war for long stretches of time for a very long time. And, if you think back to something like World War II, when there were rations on things. You can see this direct cost of like, okay, well, the money being spent on the war is having an impact because we now have rationing. But it feels sometimes like because we've been at war for so much and because the numbers are often so large, it feels like it's kind of baked in. It's sort of baked into our economy. So how do we do that thing where we measure when you say this is real money? And I hear that it's like, and we could be spending it on this other thing. It sort of feels like would we really spend it on the other thing anyway?
We would, Edgar, and this is you're right. It feels a bit like funny money. We've got a several $100 billion deficit. It feels a bit like funny money because the government just seems like you can borrow endlessly.
Yeah,
but it's not true. Borrowing has consequences. The government does ultimately face a limit on its spending ability. Ultimately, the bill comes due. Now, unlike the state, the bill does not come due next year. The state has a balanced budget amendment. We have to pay for things the next year. The federal government doesn't have that. But ultimately, these bills do come due. And if you are spending $200 billion on a war, that is ultimately $200 billion you are not spending elsewhere, or that you're raising more in taxation. Okay, something has to give. Ultimately, the budget has to balance. So this is consequential. Let me say another thing, Edgar, it's very important. This is the tip of the iceberg. Okay?
Go ahead. Why is that?
Because traditionally, war funding requests are always much smaller at the beginning than they end up being. So let's take the Iraq War. The Bush administration estimated the Iraq War would cost us $50 billion. Okay. One of their chief economic advisors, Larry Lindsey, who was a well-known conservative, got fired because he said it might be something like 4 times as much. So they fired him.
Yeah.
Turns out the cost of the Iraq War was $2 trillion. Okay, $2 trillion. Why? Well, partly because wars go on longer than you say they're going to go on. They're slow to ramp down. But partly because there's lingering human consequences of war that have, in particular, medical costs and disability costs. We are very good now at keeping soldiers alive who are injured. So much, injuries that would have killed people in World War II, we now largely keep people alive. We keep them alive with disabilities that require medical care and other care, and that costs money, and that comes out of our VA budget. So basically, $200 billion is not the be-all and end-all, okay?
Right.
That could just be the start, and the ultimate cost could be much, much larger.
You listen to The Curiosity Desk on GBH. We're talking with the MIT economist Jon Gruber about the cost of war. Okay, so those are 2 dimensions, sort of human cost, budgetary concern, other dimensions through which you are looking as an economist at this situation.
Yeah, I mean, the third is in terms of economics activity. So basically, and this comes, you just heard a moment ago, the gas just hit $4 a barrel. And basically, that's going to have significant economic drag eventually on our economy. It hasn't yet, but it will if it remains there. But once again, we come back to something I've talked a lot about on GBH, which is it's just the uncertainty that's imposed on the economy. Businesses don't like uncertainty. They want certainty. They want to know that they can invest. They want to know, should they build this plant or not build this plant? Well, that'll depend a lot on what the cost of energy is going to be. And so we don't know. So that third source, the cost to our economy, is very important. We haven't felt it in a major way yet in terms of economic statistics, but we will soon if this war continues to drag on.
When we look at economic activity, I think about, can you talk about how do we factor in the idea, when we say cost, right? We spend $200 billion on a war. Presumably every dollar spent by the government is a dollar made by somebody somewhere, right? So when we look at, what the money is being spent on, how is this the same or different from any, say, large corporation going on a spending spree and just injecting a bunch of money into the economy? I mean, presumably there are winners here, and there are people who win by the winners winning.
That's right. And this raises a couple different issues. First of all, we have to remember the answer to your question very much depends on the underlying economic condition. If we're in a massive, massive recession, then it's true that if you hire someone for $100,000 to be a technical worker building a missile, that is someone who otherwise would have zero. But that's not the case. Most of the people you're bringing on to build these missiles are leaving other jobs. So it's not like you're creating $100,000 in economic activity.
Right.
You're maybe giving them a raise from $80 to $100,000. You're maybe just shifting them over. So the gain in activity is much, much smaller than the 200 billion you're injecting, because you're bringing people over from other things they would have been doing anyway.
Gotcha.
So it really depends, Edgar, very much on the underlying state of the economy. When a company decides to spend, when Meta decides to spend billions of dollars building a data center, they have made the calculation that the money they will earn off building that data center will exceed the costs they spend from building it. With war, that's not the case. We've made the calculation that there's other reasons why we want to win this war, national security or other things, but we aren't claiming we're going to make that money back.
Right.
That money's gone. And that's money the U.S. taxpayer or the U.S. or people who benefit from U.S. government spending have to make up later on.
You listen to the Curiosity Desk on GBH. We're talking with the MIT economist Jon Gruber about the cost of war. As we said at the beginning here, one of the conversations happening right now is this going to shift into a phase where boots are on the ground? As an economist, you look at that as a potential next phase. What does that change in your thinking, if anything?
Yeah, look, this is really interesting because obviously any loss of life is tragic and a very sympathetic statistic. So we read about 12, 13 lives lost and we say that's terrible. But let's also let's also remember that the money we're spending on the other aspects of the war also have consequences for human life.
Right.
And why is that? That's because what we talked about before, Edgar. You could have done something else with that money. Okay. So for example, the best estimates are that you can save a life by giving someone public health insurance for about $5 million.
Okay.
So for about $5 million of public health insurance, you can save a life. Okay. Well, think of what that means. That means the $200,000 billion request the Trump administration is making is 20 to 40,000 lives worth of people.
Wow.
Okay. So when we say, well, gee, when Rubio says there'll be no boots on the ground, but I want $200 billion, isn't that great? No one's going to die. Well, that's not true, because by spending $200 billion on this war, people are going to die. People will not get the benefits that government spending could deliver in other contexts. Now, will it be 20 to 40,000 people? That depends on how else the money would have been spent, but it's not zero.
Right.
Like, it's very important. We tend to think, this is why people like economists, is we point out that we tend to think of human lives as worthy and dollars as dispassionate, but the dollars matter. Yeah. The dollars matter because something else could have been done with them that could be valuable and could ultimately save lives. And it's not painless. When Rubio says, don't worry, there won't be boots on the ground, just give me couple $100 billion. That is not a statement we should not worry about. We should be very worried about what that money could be done with otherwise.
And one of the other things you point out really quick before I let you go, obviously one of the costs of war, one of the reasons, as you just said, why the total cost of a war balloons over time is if people are engaging in that war, we have to take care of them on the back end. So it seems to me that if we're looking at the overall cost of this war, if there are boots on the ground, if we do have more soldiers engaging in combat, you are looking at a very different level of total cost of this war as we look at it over time.
I think that's right, Edgar. We need to add both components. There's the money we're spending on missiles, but there's also the fact that every person we put on the ground, not only to risk a human life, we are imposing a cost on future U.S. taxpayers because there's a chance they'll get disabled and we'll be paying for them. So it's not either or. Both are imposing costs. I'm not saying send soldiers, don't send bombs. What I'm saying is both have a cost. And the cost to soldiers is not just the human lives. It's the fact that we are committing, and we should morally commit, that if we send a soldier into Iran, we will take care of them if they come home disabled, and that's a cost.